Today we're going to discuss melody as a part of this podcast series. I'd like to start with a quote by Nadia Boulanger. She's a very famous music composition instructor. Her quote is, "To study music, we must learn the rules. To create music, we must forget them." Now, while it probably isn't a good idea for you to forget the rules that we're learning in 151, I do want you to keep in mind that what I'm presenting today is a standard formula for an 8-bar melody. It's just a standard. All of you can go out and find exceptions to everything we're going to discuss today in your favorite music, but this is a place to start. We need to learn a few terms in order to get going. The first two terms are terms that music theorists have been fighting about all along, and they still are today. Those terms are theme and motive. Melodies are based on themes and motives. For the purpose of this class, we're going to define a theme as a long melodic idea, and we're going to define a motive as a short rhythmic idea, comparable to what you would expect in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. When you write your melodies, you can make them up of a longer thematic idea or short motives. We're going to look a little bit of both today. Terms related to the music that you see here, right? What you're looking at are 8 empty measures. Now that looks like a lot of blank real estate, especially to someone who's never written a piece of music before. We have some terms to describe that 8-measure framework. Everything you see here, all 8 measures of music, is called a period. So all of this, everything that you're looking at here, is a period of music. It's made up of 8 measures. That's the standard length of a typical melody. What you see here also are 2 separate sets of 4 measures, here and also here. Those are called phrases. So this set of 4 measures is a phrase, and this set of 4 measures is also a phrase. Those 2 phrases together combine to make a complete musical sentence, which is called a period. So a phrase would be sort of a sentence fragment, and when you put 2 phrases together, that will equal a period of music. You'll notice that each phrase is 4 measures long. That, again, is the average length for a phrase within a period of music, but you can find all sorts of exceptions to those if you look through music that you like. There's names for these phrases. This first phrase is called either the antecedent phrase or the question phrase. That's because it sets the music up. It lends you to expect something. You need to get something resolved, which happens in this second phrase, which is called the consequent or the answer phrase. So we have a question phrase, starts everything out, gets the sentence going, and then to finish that sentence, we have the answer phrase. Music is all about tension and release. And in order to do that, we need to have some notes in those measures, and the notes in those measures have various names called scale degrees. These scale degrees are going to have a different effect on the music depending on how you use them and where you use them. These are the scale degree names for a C major scale. The scale is based on this note right here, which is called the tonic. You'll notice that the tonic begins the scale, the tonic also ends the scale. That note determines the key that you're in, and that determines the relationship of all of these other scale degrees. The tonic is the note that's going to bring your melody to a stop. It's the note that gives you the most rest. Music is all about tension and release, and if you want to end that tension, if you want to bring your music to a close, if you want to stop your melody, if you want to complete your musical sentence, this is the one you're going to want to use, is the tonic. So I'm going to use that in red, same as you would use for a stop sign, because that's the effect that a tonic has, is it's going to stop what you're doing. Now, the notes that have the most tension, the ones that want your melody to move back to that tonic and go ahead and stop you at that point, the ones that are going to make that motion forward are these 3. The dominant, and I'm going to underline those with green because those are the ones that have the most forward moving force. Have a leading tone, and we also have the subdominant. Right? So those particular three notes are the three notes that cause the most tension, that are in the greatest need of resolution to get back to the tonic. Now you'll notice we have three other scale degrees there, the supertonic, the mediant, and the submediant. Those three are the ones that they won't give you the same feeling of rest as you would get in a tonic, but they will still give you a need to move forward. So we're going to put those in blue because they don't have the same amount of restful quality as the tonic, obviously, but they also don't have the same need to move the music forward as the dominant, the leading tone, and also the subdominant. So these here, marked in blue. So these are different levels of tension, and what you can do is, as you're writing your melody, you can control how much tension or release you have in that particular melody by where you use these particular scale degrees. Now we also need some tools to build melody. Melodies are built using two things. They're built using steps and they're built using leaps. If you have steps in melody, you have something called conjunct motion, where everything moves very smoothly from one note to the next. If you have leaps in the melody, you have something called disjunct motion, where things shift around and they bounce around between different notes. So it's not as smooth. Moving in a scale would be conjunct motion. Leaping around anything larger than a major second, so in other words, a minor third and larger, is disjunct motion, and it's caused by a leap. Most melodies are a combination of steps and leaps. All right? This is an example of a melody with too many steps, and I'm going to go ahead and play that for you. Right, notice that that doesn't really go anywhere. It just sort of wanders around. Right, the reason for that is because you have too many steps there, and they all sort of just meander around the same point. You notice they also don't use any of those high tension notes, which are the subdominant, dominant, and leading tone. Now, I mentioned right at the beginning of this lecture that there's always exceptions to this. Let me play this example that has too many steps again. All right, now, all I'm going to do is change the rhythm. I'm still going to use the same three notes. All right, a lot of you probably recognize that from the Charlie Brown series. That's a very famous piece from that particular cartoon that uses the same notes, but obviously puts a very interesting rhythm. So right there, even though technically you're only using steps, because of the rhythm, you're making something interesting. So in general, you want your melody to be a combination of leaps and steps, but there's examples of steps that do work. This one isn't one of them. Here's an example of some steps that work. This is a melody by Mozart. All of you probably will recognize this. All right, notice we've got a leap here in the beginning, but everything after that is all steps. This is a very famous melody. Started out as a French folk song, and then Mozart did a theme and variation on it. You may now know it as Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or the ABC song. But that particular melody has been used quite frequently all over, and all of you already know it. That's an example of steps that work. Here's an example of too many leaps. All right, this melody, I'm going to go ahead and play this for you. This one doesn't work. Now you can tell I've exaggerated here, and I've done all sorts of leaps as a part of this melody. But it's not going to sound very good because it just wanders all over without any sense of direction whatsoever. Okay, that's an example of too many leaps that don't work. However, I can play for you another example by Mozart of a melody where the leaps work. This particular one, you notice almost everything, there's a step right here, there's a step right here, but everything else as you go through are all leaps, and this is how this melody sounds. Right, much better than the other one. You also need a few more devices in order to write your melody. Not only do you need steps and leaps, but you're also going to need some larger scale structures. Those are repetition, contrast, and variation. Repetition is exactly what you would expect. That's where a particular item in the melody, it can be a short motive or it can be an entire phrase, is repeated in the music. You can also use repetition to link two phrases together. Contrast is when you write two phrases that contain contrasting material. That creates tension and interest because you're doing something different. And variation is halfway between repetition and contrast. That's when you have two phrases that have some recognizable material and some varied material. Here's an example first of repetition. If you look at this particular melody, notice it has a combination of steps and leaps. That's what we talked about, steps, right? Here's some leaps, right? Steps, here's some leaps. But you'll also notice there's a lot of repetition. There's repetition within each phrase. Here's a phrase, right? Repetition right here, this segment. It's repeated twice within the phrase, but it's also repeated between the two phrases. So you'll notice you have that same segment down here. This is a different segment that has a leap in it, right, instead of a step. You'll notice that's also repeated down here. Right, so this whole melody, this whole 8-measure period of music, is based on repetition. I'll go ahead and play those 8 measures for you. Right? While that may not hit the top 40 charts, that particular melody is well put together, and you can tell that the two phrases are related. Now, you may not want to write something that is quite that similar. That was just an example to give you an idea of how to use repetition. So, instead, you might prefer an example that uses contrast. And you'll notice again, this one also includes leaps and steps. Balance between the two, all right? More steps in the beginning and then some leaps for the contrast in the second phrase. Here, one thing that does happen is you'll notice that there's this little idea here where you have 2 repeated notes and then a quarter note, 2 repeated notes and then a quarter note, just to make sure these phrases do seem like they are somewhat belonging together. We do have these 2 notes repeated over here. Here's this example. Right? Even though the 2 phrases are contrasting, they still work, partly because of the fact that you have this little motivic idea that ends up being repeated, even though these leaps are such a contrast to the beginning statement. And the last example is one that includes variation. There's 2 different types of variation that we can look at, one of which is variation that can happen between the 2 4-measure phrases. And I'll also show you another Mozart example where there's variation within one phrase. This is an 8-measure period that's using variation. Okay. You'll notice we have some measures that have this kind of rhythmic pattern where you have 4/8 notes. Notice we have 4/8 notes down here as well, but this particular measure has a different pattern. Notice that these measures are identical. They have G, E, F, and D, G, E, F, and D. This measure starts with a G, this measure starts with a G, both of them quarter notes. There's just enough here that is similar and repeated that you wouldn't want to call this contrast, but yet there's also enough that is different that you would call it variation. Here's this example. Okay, again, combination of contrast and repetition gives you variation. Here's an example that I play all the time in class that is an example of variation where you have similarities and differences just within the first 4 measures. This is a very famous opening of a Mozart piano sonata, And you'll notice that even though all of these notes are quite different, this is set a little lower on the staff, this is set a little higher, the rhythms are almost identical. In this first measure, you have a half note and a quarter note and a quarter note. This measure here is a half note, quarter, and quarter. Second measure, you have a longer note value followed by some decorative notes and then a quarter note and a quarter rest. And over here, you have a longer note value followed by some decorative notes and then a quarter note and a quarter rest. That's an example of how you can use variation where there's a lot of difference in the notes, but the rhythm ties everything together. I'll play that example for you. Now that we've looked at steps and leaps, we've looked at repetition, contrast, and variation, we need to talk about how to go ahead and put together our own melody. And for that, I'm actually going to use a melody that was written by a 151 class. And I'm going to go through the steps that we did to get to this point with this melody. And keep in mind, this is just one example. You can go ahead and write your own and choose whatever you'd like to do. And this class went through it. And the reason I picked this particular melody is that most classes are pretty careful. They're pretty conservative when we go through this and write a melody as a class. They're worried about getting things wrong, so they don't want to do something different or out of the ordinary. Well, this class was never worried about doing anything wrong, and they really like to do things out of the ordinary. So this melody is the one I'm going to use. It's a good combination of steps and leaps. It's a good combination of variation and repetition, but they also do some interesting things with those scale degrees. Some of you who have never written a melody before, probably looking at these 8 blank measures, and the temptation is to start writing here at beat 1 and go ahead and just write until you finish over here at the end of measure 8. The problem with that is you sort of end up writing the equivalent of a run-on sentence where the melody just doesn't seem to hang together and doesn't make sense. There's some easy ways to do this, and you think of it the same way you think of building a house. Before you put on the siding, before the drywall goes on, you have to sort of create a framework. And that's what we're going to do here. In this framework, the first thing you have to do is you have to let the listener know what key you're in. You have to introduce the tonic. So here in measure 1, you're going to want to have a tonic. Okay? That's one place that you need to do that in order for someone to start recognizing the difference between that tension and release that's going to happen between those various scale degrees. So we're going to start with the tonic. We obviously need a time signature so that we have a framework for what we put in each measure. So we're going to work with 2/4. I do that in class just because it's easier to write a complete 8-measure melody when you're only working on 2 beats per measure. But melodies can be any different time signature. So at this point, we have a tonic here. We know we're in 2/4, right? The next benchmark, the next part of your framework you can create is where you're going to end up at the end of measure 8. Now, in order to make a complete musical sentence, what you have to do is you have to create that feeling of rest, that feeling of stopping. The way you do that is by ending on the tonic. Again, remember, that's that scale degree that creates that feeling of rest. So we're ending on the tonic. Now, when you start and end on the tonic, when you're introducing the tonic here in measure 1, or when you're ending on the tonic, it doesn't work very well to use a small note value. You aren't going to want those tonics to be on a 16th note. The reason for that is if you start on a 16th note and that's all someone gets for the tonic at the beginning, it doesn't give them a chance to get used to what that tonic is, and then they have a hard time putting it in a frame of reference with the rest of your scale degrees. Likewise, over here in measure 8, you're also going to want to give your tonic some time because you want to create that feeling of stop. You want to create a complete musical sentence. The only way you can do that is if you make that note value long enough. In 2/4 time, you've only got 2 beats, so I usually recommend that you go ahead and plan for a half note tonic in measure 8 because that's the only thing that's really going to give you the feeling of stopping. If you were to take those 2 beats and just do your tonic as a little 8th note over here way at the end of the measure, it's sort of the equivalent of driving up to a stop sign and slamming on the brakes at the last minute or sort of running through. So you want to make sure there's time for that tonic to sound to let everyone know that you're stopping. Now, the next step is to look at this 8-measure period of music. You know you've got to be on the tonic here. You know you've got to be on the tonic here. That's still a lot of empty measures in between to try and make a decision as to what you're going to do. The way to handle that is to remember that the 8-measure period is made up of 2 4-measure phrases, and one of them is the question phrase and one is the answer phrase. So what that means is you can go ahead and decide how you're going to control this point right here, this point in the middle between measure 4 and measure 5, by either allowing some rest to happen right there or allowing tension to happen based on the scale degrees you put in at that point. For example, your 2 phrases can be standalone, very enclosed phrases. If you start each of them on the tonic and you end each of them on the tonic, that's going to create a closed off phrase for you. So we could do that. Okay. Those 2 phrases, each of them would stand alone. There won't be any tension at all between this first phrase and the second phrase. But you also have other options. For example, if you want this first phrase to have some tension that's going to want to move back here, instead of doing the tonic at this point, you could do the dominant. All right? If you do the dominant, that's one of those high tension members of the scale degrees that is then going to move back to this tonic and really set you up to have this second phrase in order to finish off this note that you left hanging at the end of the first phrase. If you don't want this tension to resolve and instead you want to keep this tension going all the way until this last tonic, then what you want to do is not provide the tonic over here. So you could do anything else at that point. You could continue the dominant, or you could go to any other scale degree that's going to move you to somewhere other than the tonic. So in other words, this point right here, you can decide how much tension you want in your melody based on which scale degrees you stop on at measure 4 and where you pick up at measure 5. This particular class opted for creating a lot of tension. All right, so I've showed you the least tension, which was stopping on tonic and starting on tonic. That's what most classes want to do. But this particular class melody I'm going to do for you today, all of the students really wanted to create a high tension melody. So what they chose for measure 4 was actually the leading tone. Right, the leading tone in the melody is that note. Remember, it's the 7th degree of the scale. That really wants to resolve up that half step to the tonic. So that leading tone is going to create probably the most maximum amount of tension you can have in a melody in order to move you to the next measure. They not only wanted to create that tension in measure 4, but they wanted to continue that tension by not going to the tonic in measure 5, but by actually going somewhere different. So where they're going to choose to go, and I'm going to write that up above here so that it shows up, is the submediant. So they actually not only set this up to go to leading tone, but they really wanted to try something different and see what happened. And they set this up so that it went to the leading tone here, and then not only did they not allow that to resolve, but they took it to a rather non-traditional note, which was one of those blue notes on our scale degrees. Remember, those were supertonic, mediant, and submediant. One of those notes that don't have a high feeling of tension, but also don't put you back at the tonic. The nice thing now, even though this looks like it's a little scribbled on, is now you're not looking at 8 blank measures that you have to fill in. Right? What you're looking at instead is a framework. You know where you need to start. You know what your goal is by the end of measure 4. Right? You know where you're going to pick up in measure 5, and you also know what your goal is in measure 8. So a lot of this is already written for you. It's not quite as empty as it was before. So here's what they did. They actually started out with, here's your tonic. They started out with a C quarter note. All right, so that's our first note. And in a 2/4 measure, that's a good length because it gives you a chance to get that tonic in your ear, but it doesn't stop you. For example, if you would sit on a half note for that whole measure, that's not going to give you a whole lot of forward motion at this point. You want something that's going to need to move at the same time that you also want something that's going to introduce your tonic. So that's a perfect length for here. They decided to start with steps, so they're going to follow that with 2 steps like this. And the other thing that you want to do too is listen to your melodies. If you have a way to have access to a keyboard, you'll want to play them, or you can also use your online keyboard. But you want to listen as you're writing too, so that you know what you're putting together. So here's their first measure. All right, that was their first measure. And of course, also remember the last measure, that's already done for you. Now I'm going to put these in parentheses for right now, because remember, depending on where your melody ends up, you can either go to this tonic, which would be up higher on the staff, or you can go to this one down lower. So we don't know for sure. We know this measure's done because we have to sit on tonic, and because it's only 2/4 time, we're going to want to give that the full 2 beats. So we're already done with this. Look, you've already got 2 measures done out of your 8 without even really writing that much yet. So we're going to leave those though, because we have to decide which one we're going to want. What they did is, as a class, they looked at this and said, okay, we have all these steps here, we need a leap, and because this was a class that liked to live dangerously, this is the leap that they did. They went all the way up here, which is a rather uncharacteristic leap. It's a large leap, it's a leap of a 7th, but if you put it in and if you use it correctly, you can actually make it work. So they decided to make this a dotted quarter. Now, one of the things they also did is, if you take a leap, especially a leap that large, most of the time it sounds good to move back in the opposite direction of that leap in order to make that work better. It's just something that our ears prefer to hear us fill in that gap we created, as opposed to take another leap. You have to be really careful. Remember, we listened to 2 melodies, one where those leaps didn't sound like they were related at all, and the Mozart one where the leaps did work. But you do need to be careful, especially with a large leap like that, to make it sound like it works out well. We tried a few things that we didn't like as a class, but we ended up with this. And went back here and ended up with that, all right, which worked well, because that way we're coming out of that big leap, and when we're resolving that back down, just a step. So this is what we have so far for those 2 measures. Okay, so we have steps, leaps. They decided to follow that with some more steps. Make sure you can read these. So another measure of steps instead. Now, at this point, they had already decided they needed to go to the leading tone, so they had no choice here. And they did go to the leading tone, but what they did, just to make it a little more interesting, instead of just sitting on a half note, which gives you that feeling of really stopping, is they made this another dotted quarter, which again sort of reminds everyone of the dotted quarter that you had back here, and then put in an 8th rest. All right, so here is their first phrase. Okay, interesting because of the leap, and then sounds good because it's followed by a step, and then a combination of alternating between stepwise motion here, stepwise motion here, and then the dotted quarter and the dotted quarter. So that whole phrase works together nicely. Now the catch is, how do you write this second phrase to be contrasting, repetition, variation of this first phrase, so that the 2 phrases together make sense? Remember, they decided they wanted to go to the submediant here. So they had to go to an A, because that's the submediant. And they decided to mimic this motion a little bit in here, but change things. And again, this class liked to try doing things different. So they actually came up with sort of an interesting use for this measure, very much on the end of contrast, which is they're doing stepwise motion, which is the same motion that they started here. But what they decided to do instead is actually make this into a triplet. Okay, so that comes totally out of the blue, is definitely contrast compared to the first phrase. So here's the first phrase. There's your triplet. Now, at this point, as a class, we discussed the fact that, we hadn't had a triplet before. It's a nice, interesting addition to the melody, but it's so different that we want to make sure we put in something that's going to remind us of what we set up in the first phrase. So at this point, this is what they decided to do. They went up here and did this. Okay, and again, some of this happens with trial and error where they would try some measures first, they wouldn't like something, and they try something else. So this isn't just the one solution they came up with right away. So you should assume for your own melodies there may be some measures and some things you try that aren't going to work out as well either, and you want to try again. Notice that the nice thing about this is we've got this very different measure here that brings in some contrast, but then this A to the G mimics that jump of a seventh, the same as you had this jump of a seventh here, and then dotted quarter to eighth mimics dotted quarter to eighth, and the fact that this moves by step and this moves by step. What happens then is you do have this very different material, but you can pull it off because you tie it together with something that's almost identical to what happened in the first phrase. And notice it even happens at the same point between measure 1 and 2, which is the first two measures of the first phrase, and between measures 5 and 6, which is the first two measures of the second phrase. So that ties these two together. Okay, so here's what they had at this point. Okay, now at this point, because you've set up your framework already, you only have one measure left to write. So all you need to do is get from here to here. Now usually if you've only got 2 beats left, good rule of thumb is if you're sitting this high on the staff, what's going to happen is you're going to want to use this tonic, because this one down here, it's going to be really difficult to get yourself all the way from here all the way down to this tonic. This one's closer. Okay? So we're going to stick with this tonic at that point, and we need to get to that tonic. And what the class ended up doing was this. Okay. What that does is it does another leap of a seventh, but this time going in the opposite direction. These two went up. This one goes down this time, but it also mimics the same rhythm and the same stepwise motion that you had here in measure 1. So you're tying these two measures together. So again, even though you've got some very different elements in this second phrase, you're putting them together in a way that works well. So here's the entire melody. Right, and there it is, and it works very nicely. Now again, keep in mind, I went through this melody that the class did by not putting through every single thing that we tried to get to this point. So keep in mind that for your own melodies, you may not be happy with the first set of measures you come up with. You may need to rework some spots. But at least if you give yourself some guidelines, it'll be easier than just trying to write from beat 1 of measure 1 all the way to the end of measure 8 without any guideposts along the way to give you some idea of how to put your melody together. All right, go out and write your first melody and enjoy.